All right, fire up A-Push Scholars. Mr. Beamer here for another video. This video is not going to be over the keynotes. This is going to be a review for our test over chapters 11 through 14. There's a lot of information here, so I'm going to try to give you a quick summary of the most important stuff of this time period. We go from Jefferson in 1800 to Jackson's presidency. And actually, we go a little bit after that. And the last major event is the election of 1840 with William Henry Harrison in a log cabin campaign. We know Harrison gives a long speech, and then he dies 34 days later. Too bad for William. Okay, so here are 4 chapters. The test will be covering. Chapter 11 is on Jefferson. Chapter 12 is on the War of 1812, a little bit of Madison, a little bit of rise of nationalism, and some events during Monroe's presidency. Chapter 13 and 14 are both about Jackson. The first chapter, 13, is about the election of 1824, and then the early stages of Jackson's presidency. And chapter 14 is a lot more detail of the major events of Jackson's presidency, and then the rise of the Whigs, and then eventually it's going to get into the last thing, the election of 1840. So my goal is to go through every chapter in the next 4 or 5 slides and just kind of highlight the most important things that you need to remember and be aware of for our test. Okay, first of all, the test, as all of my tests are going to be, for the most part, in chronological order, so most of the first part of the test is going to be on Chapter 11, so it's Jefferson's presidency. He was president from 1801 to 1809. We'll also touch a little bit on James Madison. Okay, so the first major event is the election of 1800 between John Adams, who was the Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican. Okay, so that was a major election. They call it the Revolution of 1800, and you should know that they call this the Revolution of 1800 because it was the peaceful transfer of power from the Federalists to the Democratic Republicans. There was no revolution, or there was no rebellion or fighting between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. All right. Also, things you need to know is Jefferson, and the Democratic Republicans, what were some of their beliefs? Most Democratic Republicans were for, especially Jefferson, was for the yeoman farmer, and also a lot of them for states' rights. Okay, so the DRs were more states' rights people. The Federalists were for a stronger federal and central government. Also, be aware that after the election of 1800, there are no more Federalist presidents, and the Federalists slowly die out till 1816 is, I guess, the official death of the Federalists after the War of 1812. Big reason why the Federalist Party never really succeeded is they could not appeal to the common man. Again, when I think of the Federalists, I think of elitists. Alexander Hamilton, I think of wigs. And so wigs that you wear in your hair, not the wig party, so don't get confused there. But again, the Federalists couldn't really appeal to the common man. They're more for the elitists. And of course, America was growing substantially with many people. Most Americans were farmers, and they couldn't identify themselves with the Federalists. Okay, the next is the court case of A-Push and Marbury versus Madison, 1803. John Marshall is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and we know that this case is about judicial review, that the judicial branch, which is the courts, they can rule laws of Congress unconstitutional. And this is so significant because it brought more power to the judicial branch and made it equal in terms of power with the legislative branch, which is Congress, the executive branch, which is the president, and the judicial branch. So a key note, John Marshall, most of his decisions brought more power to the federal government at the expense of the states, but this one did not. Again, this one brought more power for the judicial branch versus the legislative and executive. Of course, Jefferson's greatest legacy is Louisiana Purchase, 1803. Of course, he had to wrestle with that because he didn't know if it was constitutional, because there's nothing in the Constitution about the buying of land. So he didn't know if he could do it, but he did anyway because he wanted the land and thought it would have been good for America. Again, Jefferson was a strict constructionalist. He can only do what's in the Constitution. The Federalists were more for loose construction. And so the buying of Louisiana was more of a loose construction because it didn't say he could do it, but he did it anyway. Jefferson's greatest criticism is the Embargo Act of 1807. Basically, he agreed to not trade with either France or Britain. Okay, so he shut down trade. Again, the reason or the cause of the Embargo Act was the impressment of sailors by the British and the French. And so he's like, I'm not going to trade with either. It was kind of a selfish, childish thing to do. And that's his biggest criticism. Okay. And eventually, indirectly, this is a cause of the War of 1812 because this does actually increase tensions with the British. Lastly, a little bit of tidbits of importance here for our test. Madison's leadership as president. What was James Madison? We don't talk about much. It was the father of the Constitution, but when he was president, he was actually a very weak leader. Okay, did not show leadership like Jefferson could, or even obviously George Washington. So he was a weak leader as president. He didn't really have a good grasp of the War of 1812. Did not show great leadership there. So that is a criticism of James Madison's presidency. Again, when we think of Madison, really his main event is the War of 1812. Going on to a new chapter. We're going on to chapter 12. This is the second chapter. Quite a bit of stuff here. This is on Madison and Monroe's presidency. Again, I mentioned in the previous slide, when you think of James Madison, you've got to think about the War of 1812. That's really his war, which a cause of that is the upsurge of nationalism, some pride to be an American. I started to sing there. Not very good at that. And then the second part is the major events of Monroe's presidency. So we'll hit that. Actually, we're going to use 2 slides to cover chapter 12. So the War of 1812. Clearly, we need to know the causes of the War of 1812. Biggest cause is probably the impressment of our sailors by the British, but also because the British were arming Native Americans on our western frontier, and so they're giving Native Americans weapons to fight against America, and that made us mad. Okay, now we're going to get into some geography. We're going to look at the supporters of the War of 1812 and people that were not against it. The War of 1812 was supported by the War Hawks. Okay, the 2 most famous War Hawks are John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay. Yes, those 2 John C. Calhouns and Henry Clays. Henry Clay was from the west, from Kentucky. John C. Calhoun was from the south, from South Carolina, and they supported the War of 1812. The people that did not support the war were in New England. Okay, and hopefully you can keep that in mind. The North did not support the war as much as the South and West, and especially New England. A lot of New Englanders did not support the war because they were more friendly to the British. They liked the British, and they did not want America to fight them in the War of 1812. All right, one of the most famous Native Americans you need to know is Tecumseh. Again, this is around 1811, 1812. He tried to unite Native Americans against the United States, and he was somewhat successful in doing that. One of the few Native Americans that tried to unite the different tribes against America, and he was a thorn in the side of the United States. The key battles of the War of 1812. The one that I think you need to know most is the Battle of New Orleans. Okay, and of course, who is the war hero out of the Battle of New Orleans? You should know that. And the interesting thing about that is that battle actually happened after the Treaty of Ghent was signed. The Treaty of Ghent was signed in December of 1814. The Battle of New Orleans was in January of 1815. So the battle happened with the war actually being over. And so that's kind of an interesting bit of information about the Battle of New Orleans. The other major event of the War of 1812 was the Hartford Convention in 1814. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice a little bit. I should stop yelling at my kids so much. All right, so the Hartford Convention, 1814, a must know. Okay, people of New England, they talked about possible secession. They were unhappy with the War of 1812, again, because they did not like fighting the British. New England relied on commerce, and if we're at war with the British, New England cannot trade as much, so their economy is going to struggle. So this was talk of secession. Nothing ever came about of the Hartford Convention, but it made people upset that the people of the North New England region were not being patriotic towards the war. It also signaled really the death of the Federalist Party by 1816. They no longer will be a threat. Okay, and finally then, the results of the War of 1812. The Treaty of Ghent was a treaty that signed it, or that ended the war. And I think most of us know that the war pretty much ended in a tie because the United States did not gain any land from the war, and the United States did not lose any land. So basically it ended where it began. So that's kind of the result of the War of 1812. All right, some economic ideas. Henry Clay's American system, okay, very important in APUSH. 3 parts to his system to make America a more national economy, to improve our economy. It was the bust, so a national bank. Higher tariffs to protect manufacturing, and internal improvements. I'm really going to focus on internal improvements. Now, a couple of things. Which area of the country would support internal improvements the most? Again, in early America, there are 3 main regions: the North, the South, and the West. And again, I mentioned this, I think, in class. When we talk about the West, we're not talking about the Great Plains. We're talking about areas of Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee. So that is the early American West. So which of the three would want roads and canals? And the area maybe that you would guess is the West. The West wanted roads and canals the most, mostly so they can be connected to the eastern markets, so their goods can travel a lot easier. The area that probably, this is kind of an important thing for our test, the area that probably disliked internal improvements the most was actually the Northeast. And the reason why is if there are more roads and canals, more people can leave the Northeast. They would lose population, more people would go out west. Thus, the northeastern states would have less political power in the House of Representatives because they don't have as many people. So the states of New England were not big into roads and canals being built because, again, their population would leave, they would have less political power. Okay, finally on this slide is the era of good feelings, and I feel like we know this pretty well. This is the time period with the death of the Federalist Party. In the United States history, we only had one political party, and that political party was the Democratic Republicans, and so that's why we call it the era of good feelings, because it was one political party. However, there was some bad things going on in the United States during this time period. One was an economic crisis. The other one was a major debate over slavery, which we'll get to in the next slide. All right, the second half of Chapter 12. So we already talked about the War of 1812 and Madison. Didn't really mention much about nationalism, but again, that did develop after the war. Even though it was a tie, Americans felt proud that we could stand up to the British, that we actually truly are going to be okay as a country. And so the last thing I mentioned on the previous slide was the era of good feelings, and that is the presidency of James Monroe. James Monroe presidency was the era of good feelings, only one political party. But like I said on the previous slide, there were some problems, and one is the Panic of 1819. We have 5 panics during the 1800s, and actually for this test, there are 2 of them you need to know. The Panic of 1819, and the other panic is in the Panic of 1837. Again, whenever we think of panics, we got to know causes, and the biggest cause of this Panic of 1819 is over-speculation of lands out west, especially. That's a cause of most of the depressions and panics. People bought land that they could not really pay for. They had to borrow money, and especially the farmers, that they could not get a good crop. They could not pay off their debts, and they would lose their farm. And people lost money on the speculation of this land. All right, moving on then. So people were moving out west during early America in the 1800s, and they wanted some cheap things. And I think it's important to know, whenever we think of people moving out west, most of the people, they were farmers. Okay, so as people moved out west, they were farmers, and they wanted cheap things. The first thing they wanted cheap was land. They wanted cheap land that was not too expensive. They also wanted cheap transportation. Maggie's, quiet please. Okay, they wanted cheap transportation so they could send their goods out east at a less expensive price. Maybe the most important thing they wanted is cheap money. Now, I don't know how much I discussed this in class, but farmers always want cheap money. And what that means is they want more money printed. They want more money in circulation. They want paper money. Another name for cheap money you might hear is soft money. Okay, it's just the same idea. Cheap money and soft money are the same idea. They want more paper, dollar bills to pay for things. The opposite of cheap and soft money is hard money. Okay, and that is actually gold and silver. Okay, gold especially. And so that's one way to pay for things is through hard money, paying with gold. And the Bank of the United States would prefer things to be paid with gold and silver. But the farmers, they did not want that. They wanted cheap money. And the biggest reason why, if there's more, this is an economic idea, if there's more money in circulation, if there's more paper dollars in circulation, that should cause inflation. Farmers want inflation. They want prices to go up, because they can then sell their goods for higher prices, make more money, and pay off their debts. All right, next let's look at the Talmadge Amendment of 1819. And so this is in our keynotes. And so again, 1819, Talmadge Amendment refers to Missouri. Okay, it was an amendment that was passed in the House, but not the Senate. And basically this was going to, that no more slaves can be brought into Missouri. And also it said that eventually they're going to emancipate all the slaves. So basically this amendment said that we were going to end slavery in Missouri. Well, that was a problem for the slaveholding states. Like, no, we don't want that. So there was conflict. So a compromise is brokered again by Henry Clay. So a compromise is brokered, and so now we have the Missouri Compromise of 1820. A must know. So you know the key parts of Missouri Compromise. Maine became a free state, Missouri a slave state. The other part of the compromise is that in Louisiana Purchase territory, there can be no slavery north of the 3630 parallel line. Okay, and so that abolished slavery north of the 3630 parallel line in the Louisiana Purchase territory. John Marshall, again, his Supreme Court decisions are also very important. I love John Marshall, by the way. His court decisions did two things. Number one, it brought more power to the federal government, and also it validated contracts. Both of these ideas were pro-federalist ideas. Again, John Marshall was a Federalist, and even though the Federalist Party died out by 1816, he is still around with his decisions that would support the ideas of the Federalist. Do you have to memorize all the Supreme Court cases? No, but I definitely would be aware of one or two for each. So for the stronger federal government, perhaps McCulloch v. Maryland or Gibbons v. Ogden, those are the ones that said we are going to have a stronger federal government at the expense of the states. It's a key point. He basically took away states' rights and gave more power to the federal government in those decisions. The contracts, the Dartmouth case would be a good one to remember, upholding contracts with King George III. And also he did support Native Americans, especially the Cherokees versus Georgia in the early 1830s. And of course, Andrew Jackson did not enforce his decisions with Native Americans. Finally, Monroe Doctrine. Okay, did it protect Latin America? I have no idea, but you probably debated about it, and wow, that was exciting. Okay, so things about Monroe Doctrine you need to know, and I think we know this, the three main parts. Europe cannot come to the Western Hemisphere to colonize. They cannot come to the Western Hemisphere to interfere. In return, America is not going to go to Europe. Well, who wrote the Monroe Doctrine? We know it's not James Monroe. It was the Secretary of State. Know that. John Quincy Adams wrote it in 1823. And so you need to be able to describe what the Monroe Doctrine was about. And clearly, the Monroe Doctrine is an isolationist policy, and it continues Washington's ideas of non-entanglement. So it is very isolationist, and that, of course, ends in the late 1890s with U.S. imperialism. One more thing about John Marshall, of course, being a Federalist, that's his viewpoints on things. He was a loose interpretation Supreme Court leader, okay, because he was a Federalist leaning in his decisions, so he was for a more loose interpretation. All right, just two more slides, two more chapters fire up, but it's going to take a while because we got to talk about Andrew Jackson and all of his whatever he was. All right, I'm a neutral arbiter. All right, first thing, must know, absolutely must know what New Democracy is. It begins in the 1820s. You should know what this is. It's a must know. Of course, allowed for more voting in America for white men. So you do not need to have property anymore. White men could vote, but of course we know that other groups could not vote still, women, African Americans, Native Americans. Okay, the election of 1824, one of the most important early elections in APUSH. Besides the election of 1800, know the three main candidates. Here's a little bit of nugget for you. John C. Calhoun, this is weird, but John C. Calhoun, the face of death, in my opinion, he was actually vice president for two of the presidents. It's kind of a weird thing. You don't really need to know, but it might be on the test, but it's part of a multiple choice question. The main thing, though, is it was Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay. Okay, Andrew Jackson had the most popular electoral votes, and Henry Clay actually had to drop out because he was not in the top three, so he had to go back to the House of Representatives. So really it comes down to Jackson and John Quincy Adams. And of course this leads to the corrupt bargain of 1824, and this is alleged, we don't know for sure, but John Quincy Adams wins the presidency because of the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives votes in favor of John Quincy Adams instead of Andrew Jackson. Well, John Quincy Adams takes over the presidency, and he makes Henry Clay his Secretary of State. And Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House. And some say Henry Clay maybe persuaded the members of the House to vote for Q. Adams, and eventually he would become his Secretary of State. All right, next is the Tariff of Abominations, 1828. In the past, there's always been a little bit of confusion with my APUSH students about the Tariff of Abominations. Okay, it's one of the highest tariffs ever in American history in 1828, but this does not directly cause the nullification crisis of 1832. There's still a 4-year wait, and so that's kind of an important point. The nullification crisis happens 4 years later, but this made the South very mad. They hated the higher tariff the most. New Englanders manufacturing liked the higher tariff. So in response to the Tariff of Abominations, the super high tariff, John C. Calhoun writes the South Carolina Exposition, basically saying the importance of states. States' rights is very important to him. States could potentially nullify the tariff if they don't agree with it. All right, moving on to the election of 1828, the two candidates. You should know Andrew Jackson was now a Democrat, and then he went against John Quincy Adams, who was already president. So Q. Adams won 1824. Andrew Jackson's going to win 1828. Why does Andrew Jackson win? Well, it's really because of New Democracy. Okay, he was the president of the common man. Okay, the masses of people can now vote if you're a white man, and they favor Jackson because he was like one of them in their eyes. So he wins the election of 1828 because of that. Unfortunately for Jackson, one of his criticisms is he institutes the spoils system. He gives government jobs to his friends and his buddies. That makes a lot of people upset because it's just giving perks to the people who supported you in your campaign. Jackson also has a kitchen cabinet. Okay, these are his unofficial advisors that come to the White House to give him advice. Now, I guess the president can do this, but it made some people upset, thinking, again, Jackson was kind of this shady character. He instituted the spoils system. He's got his own secret advisors. So again, a lot of people are not liking Andrew Jackson, and they're not going to like him even more later in history because they formed the Whig Party. Okay, a must know. I think the Maysville. Ooh, that's a typo. Shame on me. It's supposed to say the Maysville Road veto, not Marysville. Anyway. So the Maysville Road veto, Jackson vetoes this road. It was supposed to be a road in Kentucky, and it was supposed to be funded by the federal government. Andrew Jackson's principle is states' rights. He's more of a states' rights president, so he actually vetoes this road because he does not want the federal government spending money on internal improvements. These internal improvements, by the way, were going to help Henry Clay because he is from Kentucky. So Jackson vetoes the Maysville Road. Peggy Eaton affair, just mentioned that as well. That caused conflict in Jackson's cabinet. It was like a drama, and it caused John C. Calhoun to resign and caused tension between John C. Calhoun and Jackson. So that caused Calhoun to not like Jackson. This probably caused Clay to not like Jackson. You've probably seen the trend. Finally, Webster-Hayne debate, 1830, debate between the North and the South in 1830. The biggest issues was states' rights versus federal government. The tariff was a big issue as well. The one issue not mentioned, though, was slavery. And, of course, that's going to be the biggest issue of them all as we get closer to the Civil War by 1860. Hey, fire up the final slide for this test review. All right, so this is Chapter 14, again, more political stuff, again, more Andrew Jackson stuff. And we also are going to look at his major events, the rise of the Whigs, and the election of 1840. Now, we've already hit a few of his major events before. The spoils system is probably the biggest event, and the Maysville Road veto in the previous slide. Maybe the biggest event besides the bank wars is the nullification crisis. This is a huge event in APUSH. I think we've talked about that a decent amount in class, but again, it has to do with South Carolina. South Carolina does not like the tariff. In 1832, Congress passed a new tariff. It was actually lower slightly than the Tariff of Abominations, but the South still thought the tariff was too high, and specifically South Carolina. So South Carolina says they are going to nullify this tariff of 1832. They're not going to follow it, and they're just not going to do it because they felt states have the right to do this. Andrew Jackson gets mad. He threatens them, says, I'm going to send the troops down there to make sure you do it. In the end, before any fighting breaks out, a compromise tariff of 1833 is created by Henry Clay, and it lowers the tariff quite a bit for the South. So the nullification crisis ended because of the compromise tariff of 1873. All right, another major event are the bank wars of the 1830s. Andrew Jackson versus the bus. And the bus was led by Nicholas Biddle, but also strongly supported by Henry Clay. And we know that Jackson does not like the bus because the bus hurts farmers, and Jackson is supported by these people, the common man. So basically, Jackson vetoes the bus and says, we are not going to recharter the bus. So the bus eventually does die out by 1836. The problem, though, is there's still money in the bus. And so Andrew Jackson takes some of the money out of the bus and he puts it in his pet banks or his Western Wildcat banks. These are state banks. They're not as big as the bus, so they're smaller banks. And so this government money is going into these smaller banks. Unfortunately, they're not the most sound financial banks as the bus was. They make poor decisions, and a lot of them actually go out of business later, which of course could lead to the Panic of 1837. All right, so I already mentioned Jackson's pet banks or Western Wildcat banks, and so that he took money and put them into his money from the bus and put into his pet banks. All right, so that's some economic stuff. Let's go now to some social history. The Indian Removal Act of 1830. In the southeastern part of America, so we're thinking of states like North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Native Americans were removed from there, and they had to eventually go west of the Mississippi River to Oklahoma Territory. Eventually, it's going to be Indian Territory for a while, and so that was the law that was passed by Andrew Jackson. The reason for the Indian Removal Act is because Jackson wanted that land to be given to white people because there's more population, it's growing, and so that's what happens. And so Native Americans are forced to leave. And eventually, the most famous and saddest event is the Trail of Tears, 1838 to 1839, when 15,000 mostly Cherokee Native Americans are forced to leave, and they're forced to march over 1,000 miles, and unfortunately 4,000 of them die along the way. So basically, the Trail of Tears was just a forced removal of the Native Americans. All right, more events. Texas independence. This is towards the last year of Jackson's presidency, and Texas wins their independence against Mexico. They're independent from the Mexicans, and Americans actually help Texas. Okay, and some Americans go down there. Davy Crockett, maybe the most famous American, goes down to the Alamo. Unfortunately, Davy Crockett died at the Alamo, but Americans do help the Texans get their independence. And of course, eventually the Texans are going to want to become Americans. They want protection from America against Mexico, and they want to join the United States. But we know that there is a 9-year delay. Texas does not get annexed into the United States until 1945, and it's all because of slavery. Okay, people in the North, there's more abolitionists, there's more anti-slavery people now in the North by 1836, and they do not want to annex Texas because they do not want another slave state. Okay, now moving on a little bit more political stuff. We got the Whig Party being formed in 1834. The main reason for the formation of the Whig Party was the hatred of Andrew Jackson. The two big Whigs, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, did not like Andrew Jackson. John C. Calhoun is temporarily a Whig, and of course he doesn't like Jackson either. Okay, so that's the formation of the Whigs, and their first presidential candidate is William Henry Harrison in 1836. He does not win that election. He loses it to Martin Van Buren. But 4 years later, 1840, the same two people, Harrison, the Whig, and Martin Van Buren, the Democrat, go against each other, and Harrison wins this election because he is portrayed as a poor farmer, and they call this the log cabin campaign. Harrison Whig's friends, his friends, basically portray Harrison as a poor farmer who grew up in a log cabin, which he did not. But again, they're trying to mold him into this image so the common man would vote for Harrison, and it worked. So Harrison became president, unfortunately, for only 30 to 40 days because he gave a 2-hour speech in a terrible cold storm, and he got pneumonia, and he eventually died. All right, finally, last couple things. Ideology differences between the Democrats and Whigs. This is in my keynote, so definitely want to review this. I think that's important that you know some differences. Overall, Democrats are probably more for states' rights than the Whigs, although there were some Southern Whigs that were for it. So overall, more for states' rights. Overall, more for a bigger federal government were the Whigs. Whigs were more for internal improvements, especially with Henry Clay, a higher tariff as well as kind of what the Whigs wanted. All right, some more differences. When I think of the Democrats, I definitely think of the common man. They're not really big into the wealthy or the elitists. That's more of a Democratic idea. I think that's important. All right, and the final thing is the main similarity between the Dems and the Whigs. I think this is important to know that both political parties were mass-based political parties. So what does mass-based mean? Is they wanted to get as many people into their party as possible. They were not sectional parties. They were not just in the North or just in the South. They were national parties all over the United States. There were Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats, Southern Whigs and Northern Whigs. So they want to get as many people as possible, so we call these mass-based political parties. This is going to change, though, in 1854 when the Republicans come along and they are truly a sectional party because the Republicans are only in the North. Good luck. Fire up. Make yourself proud. Make me proud. Make your mom and dad proud. Make John Green proud. Make John Marshall proud. And finally, make Miggy proud.